Hey there! Tonight, we drift softly back into the medieval world again. The candles burn low. The fire has settled into quiet coals. The streets outside are dark, save for the occasional lantern swinging in a night watcher's hand. Somewhere, a bell marks the hour, perhaps 1 or 2 after midnight. It's the kind of hour when history feels closer, when old stories begin to breathe again, very slowly, as though they were never quite finished. And tonight, we'll wander through the most peculiar kind of story. Not battles or coronations, not saints or sinners exactly, but whispers. The sort of whispered things that trickled around wooden tables and across church pews. We linger among conspiracy theories, but medieval ones, those strange suspicions that peasants muttered in taverns, merchants traded behind closed shutters, and priests noted in the margins of their manuscripts, as if embarrassed to give shape to rumor. And the curious thing about some of these, they turned out to be true, or at least true enough to make historians many centuries later look up from their books and say, gently, they weren't entirely wrong, were they? If you enjoy this kind of slow history, you may, if you wish, subscribe, though only if it helps you rest. What matters now is simply to settle in, to listen, to let the candlelight flicker faintly against carved stone and parchment edges. As we walk through these peculiar truths, the first rumor comes to us from 14th century England. The air then was thick with fear, not the quick, dramatic sort, but the lingering, ordinary fear that people lived with as naturally as they breathed damp air near the Thames. The plague had swept through not long before. Taxes seemed to appear like weeds in every season. And the French War, that endless affair across the Channel, devoured coin after coin, life after life. Among the people, there was a recurring murmur. The king's advisors were stealing the crown from within, not by rebellion nor dagger, but by paperwork and whispers. In those years, Edward II's ghost still haunted dinner conversations. His brutal death or disappearance, depending on whom you asked, was still around. His son, Edward III, had grown old now. The court was heavy with favorites and old debts. It was said that certain merchants from Lombardy had found ways to buy influence as easily as they lent money. The rumor went like this, that a secret council, half English, half foreign, met by night to decide what was best for England, and that the king himself was often the last to know. At first, it sounded like the sort of story told by weary accountants in alehouses, the kind where the ale gets thinner each year, the taxes thicker, and someone finally mutters, "It's the Italians, you know. They own the crown's purse." Everyone would nod, not because they believed it, but because everyone needed something to blame. But time has a way of collecting dust even on lies. And sometimes, when enough dust piles up, truth is uncovered beneath. Historians now know that the merchant bankers of Florence and Luca the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Frescobaldi did indeed handle England's royal finances. They funded campaigns, ransoms, and castles. Their ledgers crossed more borders than most armies ever did. And when their loans soured, when the royal promises of repayment dissolved into smoke, these same families quietly began to choose policy, to nudge alliances, to decide which soldiers marched and which stood still. For the villagers, it had been a fear. For the courtiers, perhaps a nuisance. For the bankers, it was merely arithmetic. But for England, it was a slow realization that its treasury was no longer purely its own. Letters survive faded, but legible describing meetings at night in Westminster, with foreign clerks bent over the King's accounts, arguing in nervous Latin. Records of shipments delayed until certain loans were renewed. A chronicler from St. Alban's writes of a merchant's council, and for centuries it was dismissed as satire, only with the rediscovered correspondence between the Bardi firms and the Crown's treasury. In the 20th century did that satire begin to look more like reporting. The oddest piece is a note-named author found tucked inside a legal ledger saying, "The Crown's jewel may rest in Westminster, but its key is kept in Florence." It had been a joke, until it wasn't. To live under such a rumor was wearying. You'd feel the taxation clerk quill scrape across parchment and imagine each stroke shaving another coin towards some banker vault across the sea. You'd hear a knock on the tavern door announcing a new levy for the King's needs, and someone would mutter, "Aye, King Giovanni of Florence, no doubt." Laughter would follow, polite, slightly frightened. Years later, when the Florentine houses collapsed under unpaid loans and cascades of bankrupt clients, including King England's credit imploded, the rumor that England was run by Italian bankers ended with those bankers' ruin. The rumor, as it turned out, had been perfectly true, only reality had ended up worse than anyone's imagination. And so the story drifts away, like candle smoke, leaving a faint lesson behind. Sometimes the most absurd conspiracies are merely accounts unpaid, and promises to believable. But as one whisper faded, another was already being born in a smoky room nearby. This one belonged to France, to the early 15th century, to the reign of Charles VI. The Mad King imagined Paris then, stone bridges thick with shops, walls reeking of tallow and gossip, the war with England breathing through every street, and a monarch who sometimes thought he was made of glass. Among the nobility, factions grew like mold on old bread. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians to proud houses, both claiming to serve the same France, both insisting the other was possessed by treachery. And so it seemed inevitable that the people of Paris invented or discovered a theory that there were secret meetings between Duke John of Burgundy and the English ambassadors, in which the fate of France itself was traded away like silk. At first, it sounded typical of factional talk, each side accusing the other of sleeping with the enemy. But when, one chilly night in 1407, Duke Louis of Orleans was hacked to death in a narrow Parisian lane, those whispers stiffened into certainties. The official story was quick, robbers. The unofficial story was quicker, Burgundy. The next morning, pamphlets, handwritten things copied and recopied by candlelight appeared in churches and marketplaces, claiming that Burgundy had hired killers, that the murder was political, that France's own nobility was sliding a dagger between its ribs. It would take centuries of archives to prove that the rumor was not in flavor, but in fact true. We now know the Duke confessed shortly after, not from guilt but calculation, admitting he had had it done for the good of the kingdom. And the court chroniclers, struggling to find words polite enough, recorded it as a sort of public secret. But imagine what it felt like to hear it then. News arrives slowly, as all things did in that age. You might hear a drunken soldier in a tavern swear he'd seen a horseman deliver gold to the assassins. You might hear a monk whisper that the church bells rang that night with an odd urgency, as though heaven itself had been told in advance. You might even start wondering whether any noble's death was ever what it seemed. And even when Burgundy's confession became common knowledge, the rumor refused to fade. It shapeshifted. Some said that King Mad and Malleable had approved it himself. Others said England had foreknowledge, and thus delayed a truce to benefit. Every version fit at least someone's fears. In hindsight, we can see how correct the gossip was. The alliance between Burgundy and England would soon flourish openly, carving France in two. Paris would fall under Burgundy's sway, and in its taverns, no one would have been surprised. They had already believed it for years. That is the uneasy comfort of being a conspiracist in the Middle Ages. Every now and then, one is proven right. The streets of Paris would eventually still again, though the echo of the Duke's murder never really vanished. It drifted south along the great roads, traveling with merchants and monks, until even distant towns spoke of the king who cannot rule, and the sons who cannot serve. But while France worried about daggers in the dark, another rumor had begun rising, quietly but steadily, in the timeless city of Rome. It was a rumor about poison and popes. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the papacy was less a single throne of God and more a restless chess piece between kingdoms. The papal court had only recently wandered back from Avignon to Rome, and the city itself was a maze of crumbling palaces and private guards. Cardinals behaved like warlords. Families ruled districts like little duchies. So it should be no surprise that somewhere between the wine cups and the relic shrines, Romans began to whisper that the popes were being murdered from within. That every new papal death which came too suddenly was in fact contrived by rivals among the cardinals, and that the true weapon was never steel, but powder disguised as sacrament. At first it was gossip carried by servants' tales of taster monks who never grew old, of secret apothecaries near the Tiber who kept books written only in code. The city, thick with incense and suspicion, was the perfect soil for such stories. The common people said that during conclaves, the cloistered elections, where cardinals voted for a new pope, tiny vials were smuggled beneath robes, ready to deliver judgment upon whichever cardinal grew too ambitious. And as absurd as it sounded, history produced evidence enough to make one pause. Pope Lucius III, Alexander VI, and Adrian VI all died suddenly, leaving their doctors rich. Chroniclers called these events divine illness or seasonal fever. But let's be real, it was much more serious than that. Later records from the Vatican revealed huge payments made to some wealthy Roman families. It's those same families that suddenly gained power right after each pope passed away. The most jaw-dropping story made its way into every nook and cranny of Christendom. The death of Alexander VI, the infamous Borgia Pope. Can you believe it? People say he and his son Cesare accidentally downed the rival's wine, right? The horror, people said, was that the poison worked only halfway, leaving Cesare fevered and alive. haunted by the knowledge that the same trap had devoured his father. Modern historians still debate whether this story was slander. Yet chemical studies have exhumed remains those few unblessed fragments spared by time suggest heavy traces of arsenic and antimony, in quantities no medicine could explain. So perhaps the tavern storytellers of Rome had merely translated complicated politics into the simplest shape people could grasp: deceit in a chalice, ambition in a sip. For the monks and merchants who kept vigil outside the Vatican walls, it was proof that even the holiest men obeyed the same dark mathematics as kings and dukes. For them, faith was radiant, yet every radiance cast a shadow. When you walk today through the Vatican museums, notice how many portraits show the popes clasping their chalices delicately as if the artist, centuries later, still remembered that uneasy association between drink and death. But as with every good medieval rumor, one ending only nourished the next. The papal poisons gave birth to another fear: that relics themselves were part of a vast deception. After all, if popes could die mysteriously, who could guarantee that a fragment of bone in a jeweled case was truly a saint's? The trade in relics was enormous, almost industrial. Pilgrims bought splinters of true crosses by the handful, vials of imported sand labeled from Calvary, feathers allegedly plucked from Gabriel's own wings. In this atmosphere, it's no wonder towns began suspecting a conspiracy of counterfeit sanctity. The favorite rumor concerned the Abbey of Saint Foy in Conques, down in southern France. Pilgrims swore that its golden reliquary skull of the child martyr was not Saint Foy at all, but the bones of a local noblewoman who died in childbirth. Some even whispered the monks had stolen them from another monastery and merely renamed the poor soul for profit. Again, most listeners dismissed it until an account surfaced from the abbey's own scribe. Long hidden in monastery archives, he admitted, in cautious Latin, that several brothers had indeed carried out a furtus sacra, a holy theft spiriting relics from Agon under cover of night, so their shrine might attract pilgrims. In their minds, the deception served heaven's purpose. In truth, it served the abbey's purse. The people of Conques had not been foolish, only uncomfortably perceptive. Their crazy rumor that relics were moved, renamed, forged proved perfectly aligned with practice all across Europe. Archaeologists later confirmed dozens of saintly duplicates, 3 skulls of Saint John the Baptist, to complete skeletons of Saint James, enough true cross wood to build a modest fleet. One monk wryly wrote, "Our Lord's body is now so well distributed that each town might build him anew." For the weary medieval pilgrim, this knowledge floated somewhere between humor and blasphemy. Faith demanded belief, but experience whispered suspicion, and in the slow candlelight of confessionals, many probably admitted both at once. Even that tension between belief and doubt was its own kind of conspiracy. One fought not with swords, but with silence. Somewhere in that silence we can almost hear the echo of the modern voice saying, "They must have known, deep down. Perhaps they did." Yet the miracle of the Middle Ages is that people carried on believing anyway. Outside the abbey walls, the birds still sang, the loom still clacked, and every so often a new fragment of some saint would arrive in a silver box, and the crowds would kneel half for heaven, half for habit. And so ends one more rumor that refused to stay ridiculous. But as the monks of conquest whispered evening prayers, another rumor crossed the sea and took root among merchants whose ships groaned with goods. Those of the Hanseatic ports, the northern traders of Lübeck. Hamburg Danzig, the men who tied half of Europe together by rope and coin. The Hans, they called themselves. Respectable, open, public. Yet down on the quays, sailors muttered of a hidden council, a league within the league, which decided prices, wars, even kings. They said this secret Hans met only during storms, when the wind drowned every sound, and that no minutes were kept because the minutes were the men. To accuse merchants of running states seemed laughable to nobles. After all, in the official order of things, trade ranked below knighthood. But coins, quietly multiplied, have their own armor. Old letters found in the Lübeck archives reveal patterns eerily close to the sailors' tales. Delegates negotiated tariffs to ruined towns that had offended them, funded private navies against rival kings, and sometimes through carefully timed shortages forced whole regions into submission without lifting a weapon. It wasn't quite a conspiracy. It was simply commerce conducted in whispers. Yet to the farmers along the Baltic coast, living on fish and rumor, it felt the same. They believed the grey-bearded elders of the Hanse met in rooms lined with sea charts, deciding when herrings would mysteriously vanish that year, and strangely, when archaeologists dredged old harbors. They found layers of net weights and barrels abandoned all at once, suggesting deliberate scarcities. The medieval villages had muttered that somebody controlled the sea itself. They weren't entirely wrong. By the time royal governments caught up, entire kingdoms' economies already rose or fell by Hans' decisions. Power had simply worn a woolen cap instead of a crown. When you walk through Lübeck's medieval salt storerooms today, the air still smells faintly of ocean and money. It isn't hard to imagine whispered meetings among barrels, sealing trade pacts few would ever read. The fishermen's conspiracy had been, essentially, true only the conspirators called it business. And with that gentle realization, the northern waves quiet. Somewhere beyond the dunes, another bell sounds. One rumor sighs into silence, as the next begins to stir, far inland, in an empire of castles and cold winds. Somewhere north of the Hanse, where the air sharpened into frost and castles hunched against the wind. Another rumor began its long life one about kings who perished not in battle, but at dinner. Poison was the poor man's sword, though often it was the rich man who wielded it. By the late 1300s, so many monarchs had died, suddenly that chroniclers began to count them as omens rather than crimes. In the chilly kingdoms of Scandinavia, folks had this saying: if you spotted the king's cupbearer strutting around in a fresh cloak, it was time to pray for the king's soul. Pretty wild, right? One fascinating tale that really sticks with Denmark's history is about King Erik V, known as Clipping. It's a mystery that keeps people talking. His reign was filled with barons who thought his taxes were way too high, and his temper way too chill. In 1286, he was discovered dead in a barn close to Viborg, stabbed, they said, by some unknown hands. The chroniclers blamed bandits, while the taverns whispered about lords. What a mystery, right? And over time, the legend took shape that 24 nobles had sworn a blood oath to rid themselves of the king, and that for generations their descendants met secretly each year to renew their pact. For 6 centuries, the story survived only as folk ballad and gossip. Then, in the 19th century, when Denmark's archives underwent re-cataloguing, fragments of a confession surfaced. They were written in careful medieval Latin, sealed among property deeds. The pages detailed a council of nobles named by initials only, discussing the king's removal for the safety of the realm. The date matched the old song precisely. The villagers of Viborg had been mocked for believing a bedtime tale, yet the records confirmed it. Their ancestors had been witnesses. Their rumor was testimony. Magic had turned out to be minutes. Imagine the sound that rumor made as it passed down centuries, a low hum of we always knew. As Denmark took a moment to reflect on its history, England was busy getting really good at quietly wiping things out. In England's history books, you'll find stories about Richard II and his harsh rule. But there's a weirder side to it. All people thought their kings were just being swapped out, like candles blown out and then relit with new wax. Isn't that wild? The theory seemed mad that royal portraits were altered after coups to make new kings look conveniently like their predecessors, ensuring divine continuity. Gossip claimed that masons even adjusted tomb effigies to match new faces, so that heaven itself would not notice the switch. Ridiculous, the scholars said, until centuries later, records showed royal sculptors indeed hired to recarve features, post-succession changing noses, crowns, even inscriptions. An exception, said the court. Tradition, said the chronicler. Conspiracy, muttered the stonemason. There's a quiet comfort in those little proofs. They reveal a medieval genius for camouflage and for faith that if the stones smiled the same way, truth could safely remain ambiguous. But if England's whispers dealt in statues, the Holy Roman Empire's rumors dealt in prayers. Somewhere in the brooding mountains of Swabia, a story spread among villagers that monks were spying on their confessions, then selling the secrets to local lords. Naturally, the abbots denied it, and bishops forbade even discussion. Still, the talk persisted. Hooded figures copying names into ledgers after dusk, tallying sins by family, by tax value. It sounded absurd, cruel even. Confession was sacred. Yet when the Peace of Augsburg settled wars of faith in the 1500s, provisional documents later proved that monasteries across the empire had compiled lists of unreliable souls, for their patrons' records duplicating what peasants had described a century before. One parchment from Württemberg included the note, "She confesses skepticism of tithes." Her tenant field may thus revert to the count. The villagers hadn't imagined espionage through piety. They'd merely lacked the word bureaucracy. To think that each whispered suspicion in a candlelit chapel was worth silver in some clerk's purse, well, no wonder the peasants learned to mutter their confessions softly, eyes half open. Picture the scene. A confessional's thin wood panel, a trembling candle beyond it. Outside, rain ticking on slate roofs like the rhythm of guilt. Inside, someone struggling to decide what to omit for safety's sake. When faith turns bookkeeping, everyone becomes a little heretic. Slowly the rumor spread beyond cloisters to royal courts that the Pope himself maintained a secret index of Europe as most confessible rulers, each weakness marked for manipulation. Modern scholars believe parts of this may point toward the network of papal nuncios, who indeed recorded personal vices of princes as diplomatic leverage. So again, the impossible had been perfectly plausible. Perhaps this is why later generations of kings preferred Protestantism, less privacy, but fewer auditors in robes. By now, the medieval world must seem woven entirely of schemes. But recall, only the proven ones survived the centuries. Thousands of false rumors drifted away like candle smoke. Yet the true ones remained, faintly luminous beneath dust, quietly proud of their accuracy. Let's rest a moment in that candlelight. Imagine the long tables of scribes, the scratch of quills tallying fear into records. Imagine the smell: wax, damp vellum, unwashed ink-stained hands. The air of secrecy was not invented by fiction. It was the everyday scent of administration. And somewhere past midnight, when nearly all London slept, a monk or clerk must have paused, stretched his fingers, and wondered whether what he'd just written was rumor or revelation. The difference, in those days, was often just who read it first. Outside the monasteries, political rumors began to evolve faster than faith. Europe was growing crowded with spies. Every port had them, every court pretended not to. And in that climate, our next conspiracy takes gentle form. The claim that certain crusades were never religious at all, but profitable diversions created by merchant republics to destroy trade rivals. It sounded absurd. How could men preach the cross for profit? But even then, citizens of Venice joked darkly that their fleets carried salvation in one hold and vinegar in the other. The Fourth Crusade remains the most famous offense, a holy war that set sail for the Holy Land and landed, instead, at Christian Constantinople. The medieval rumor, whispered as early as 1200 for itself, claimed the Venetians had planned it all: the redirection, the sack, the wealth redistribution. Chroniclers branded it blasphemy. Yet the surviving contracts between Venice and Crusader leaders show clauses suspiciously favoring Venetian gain, rights to ports, markets, islands. Letters from Doge Enrico Dandolo even detail reimbursement in grain, not grace. So, once again, the rumor turned painfully literal. In taverns, people had laughed over jests that gods will smell strongly of pepper and silk. Centuries later, those jests read like footnotes to economics. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the creak of masts on the Adriatic, the gentle argument of seagulls, the muted clink of coins being counted behind crucifixes. The faithful went east pursuing heaven, and the merchants followed pursuing cargo. And perhaps both found what they sought. The night deepens. Somewhere, the wind rattles the shutters around our story. The candles gutter and lean. Yet there are still more whispers waiting in the archives. The Adriatic winds are fading now, carrying their cargoes of silk and a sprinkle of suspicion eastward. But as those sails disappear on the horizon, we're turning our gaze inward toward the dimly lit interiors of Europe's grand halls, where another kind of rumor is brewing. This one's all about faces that weren't quite right royal. Imposters, if you will. Picture this. It all kicked off in the muddy fields of 15th century France, where the Lancastrians and Valois were locked in an endless tug of war. After the shocking execution of Joan of Arc, whispers began to circulate that she hadn't actually burned at all. Instead, a peasant girl had taken her place on that infamous pyre, while the real Maid of Orleans was out there somewhere, living in secret and plotting her grand return. Can you imagine the drama? Villages along the Loire were buzzing with tales of a woman in armor, pale and silent, slipping into the forests at dawn. Now, some priests called it heresy, while soldiers found comfort in the idea. And for decades, no one could really disprove it, until, in 1436, a woman named Claude d'Aumont showed up at the court of Duke Charles of Lorraine. She bore Joan's scars, mimicked her voice, and even collected pensions from old comrades. It is wild to think that even Joan's brothers were briefly convinced she was the real deal. But the official end of this saga came when King Charles VII summoned her to Chinon. Under pressure, she confessed it was all a fabrication, but that left lingering questions. Why had so many people sworn she was the genuine article? Modern forensics on Joan's supposed relics a charred rib fragment. That has been disputed for ages, show inconsistencies with the bones of a young woman. Some historians are even murmuring that the whole execution might have been staged, that Joan was smuggled away, her legend carefully preserved for propaganda. The peasants weren't just dreaming idly. They sensed something fishy was going on amidst the flames. Living in such an environment of doubt meant questioning every banner and proclamation. A herald could ride through shouting victory, and someone in the crowd would lean in and whisper, but was it really their victory, or just another borrowed face? The air would grow thick with the scent of wood smoke and wary glances. Faith in crowns, just like faith in relics, began to fray at the edges. And from those frayed edges emerged an even darker thread. The idea that plagues were prolonged for profit. During the waves of the Black Death 1347, then 1361, and again in the 1370s, townsfolk started noticing patterns that felt to need to be mere coincidence. Quarantines would lift just as trade resumed. Wells would be sealed, then mysteriously reopened. Healers arrived with miracle cures that worked slowly. In Strasbourg, the rumor hardened into action. Jews were supposedly poisoning wells to spread the disease, all funded by Italian bankers eager to grab up depopulated lands. Mobs burned thousands before papal bulls condemned the lie. Yet beneath this scapegoating lay an uglier truth. Archival ledgers from Florence reveal that while merchants did lobby city councils to delay quarantines, claiming economic ruin. In Venice, the Consiglio dei Dici authorized grain hoarding during outbreaks, selling at triple the price once survivors emerged. One surviving memo from a Pistoia official reads, "Let the lesser gates remain barred a fortnight more. The fever clears debtors and ripe fields alike." The villagers' paranoia wasn't really about wells or Jews, it was about elites who measured. Plague in ledgers, and those ledgers, uncovered centuries later, confirmed the math. Imagine the terror of it all. Coughing shadows in the streets. The slow creak of carts hauling the dead. Then, a crier announcing that markets were reopening too soon. Always too soon. Someone in the crowd would mutter, "They wait just long enough to cull the poor," and heads would nod in the twilight. No poison in. The well's just poison in the timing. By the plague's third pass, many towns enforce their own quarantines, defying lords. This conspiracy had birthed a sense of self-rule, born out of hard-won distrust. But as bodies cooled in mass graves, another whisper rose from England's western marches, the Welsh borders where peasants spoke of cursed wells. This wasn't about natural poisonings, but deliberate sabotages by English garrisons aimed at weakening border clans. The story went that soldiers would pour lime or nightshade into springs before retreats, leaving poisoned water as a parting gift. Shepherds found livestock twisted in death throes. Children sickened after rain. Chroniclers dismissed it as Celtic fancy, until excavations at Welsh border forts uncovered pits of quicklime residue and toxic botanicals, dated precisely to campaign seasons. One knight's journal, looted from Raglan Castle, casually notes, "The well at Lontilio sweetened with salts. The Welsh will drink deep of our hospitality anin." Hospitality, indeed. For the hill folk, every sip became a gamble. Rain filled the streams, but who knew what lingered in the silt? They began marking tainted springs with white stones, a code that outlasted the wars. Today, hikers in the Black Mountains still avoid certain pools, guided by folklore that proved more accurate than maps. The curse wasn't magic, it was maintenance. These tales of deception, of borrowed faces, timed plagues, tainted waters settle now like dust on old ledgers. The medieval ear, it seems, caught truths the eye missed. People lived closer to the bone of power, feeling its tremors before any announcements. Yet not every shadow hid a scheme. Thousands of rumors proved empty. Dragon hordes, fairy changelings, and countless others that dissolved in daylight. Only the solid ones endured, patient as stone. Let your mind wander there for a moment, to the sound of water dripping in deep wells, the faint scrape of lime against rock, the hesitant taste of the first safe sip after a storm. Somewhere a fire pops softly, and the hour grows late, but our path winds onward, toward courts where documents themselves conspired. The wind outside these stories has grown quieter, as though the world listens along. Our trail now leads into the territory of parchment, the only battlefield where pen and wax fought their invisible wars. By the late Middle Ages, words themselves had become weapons, and forgery a kind of sorcery. Villagers used to joke, half in fear, that any miracle could be written into truth if enough monks copied it. And perhaps they were right. One of the earliest and grandest conspiracies of ink was the donation of Constantine. You might remember the school version, a document in which Emperor Constantine supposedly granted the Pope dominion over the Western Empire lands, treasures, even the authority to crown kings. For centuries, people accepted it. Popes waived it in disputes, like a divine title deed. Kings bowed, kingdoms paid. Accept. Curious clerks had long whispered that the Latin looked peculiar, too polished for its alleged error. Too many terms that hadn't yet existed. In small monasteries, among tired scholars and candle makers. This muttering began centuries before any formal exposure. The donation, one monk scribbled in a margin, smells of new wax. Eventually, a humanist named Lorenzo Valla put the suspicion into words that thundered through Christendom. The document was a forgery, written hundreds of years late. How many had already known? How many scribes smirked quietly while illuminating the very lie that fed them? When Valla's analysis reached Rome, it caused no revolt, no thunderbolts. The church simply moved on, gracefully. But the rumor-s vindication drifted through cloisters like relief. At last someone had said aloud what everyone had whispered beneath their breath. The donation had indeed been a conspiracy of ink. It had just taken 700 years for the truth to catch up. And yet, the church was hardly alone in such artistry. Kings forged just as deftly. In 12th century Germany, small lords discovered that parchment could enlarge estates faster than swords. They bribed abbots to rediscover monastic charters granting them forests or freedoms. A particularly patient forger from Fulda Abbey reportedly aged his documents by rubbing them with ash and beer until they smelled convincingly ancient. Generations revered those fake boundaries as divine. Right, only modern carbon dating revealed the fraud. So, yes, even land itself could be conjured by quill. A conspiracy of borders and calligraphy. In the courts above those parchments, another sort of alliance brewed, one less visible and more personal. Blood pacts made in candlelight between nobles whose family crests no longer guaranteed loyalty. The talk began in Burgundy during the 1400s that certain dukes bound themselves not with signatures but with shared wounds, mingling drops of blood as oath. Rumor had it they used relic splinters as knives, believing that Christ himself would witness the pact. One humble servant, half-literate, wrote to his cousin of a circle of lords who met near Beaune, each swearing to uphold the duke's will, no matter what France decreed. It sounded like drunk boasting, yet ledgers from the ducal treasury show irregular payments for discreet services rendered by our fraternal company. Names match those same lords. A coded habit of secrecy written between routine expenses. Centuries later, when historians pieced together Burgundian correspondence, they found references to this Company of the Thorn, a name never recorded officially, yet echoed across private letters. No manifestos, no banners, just a cluster of ambitious nobles holding quiet breakfast meetings that guided war policies behind a half-mad duke back. Their bizarre rumor had in fact directed battles. The ordinary folk in villages along the Seine had always said, Burgundy fights itself. They weren't wrong. The blood pact had given them to governments, one visible, one intimate. And then there were orders not of blood, but of stone, the great brotherhoods that outlived monarchies. None drew so many fearful epics as the Knights Templar, once celebrated as holy warriors, later condemned as heretics. Their downfall in 1307 became a thunderclap across Europe. But before that day, as the Grand Master Jacques de Molay cooled in the flames, people whispered that their riches had vanished overnight. Buried under every chapel, they said, hidden aboard a dozen ships, guarded by spirits. Take your pick. For 300 years, peasants near old Templar holdings swore by such legends. Farmers in Auvergne dug fields expecting treasure. Miners searched the Pyrenees for secret tunnels. But the strangest part came in the 19th century. When historians catalogued archives from dissolved priories, letters mentioning the fleet, the voyage, the guardians abroad, those phrases, once dismissed as tall tales, now pointed to actual ships departing La Rochelle days before the arrests, bound toward Portugal. From there, something resembling the Templars did indeed persist absorbed into the Order of Christ, quietly funding navigation ventures that would later send Portuguese caravels around Africa. The medieval rumor that the Templars survived unseen proved uncomfortably close to true, just not in the dramatic way storytellers hoped. They didn't guard the Grail. They subsidized cartographers. Still, you can picture the villagers gossiping outside smoky taverns after dusk, saying, "The Red Cross brothers never died. They just changed their uniforms." And if you visit Lisbon today, in the convent of Christ at Tamar, you'll see the old Templar crosses engraved beside nautical maps, history, preserving conspiracy as decoration. How strange that dreams and records so often shake hands. The Middle Ages, for all its superstition, was astonishingly perceptive about deception. Even with no printing press, news traveled along rumors' veins. People might not have proof, but they often had an instinct, one refined by centuries of watching power reshape itself in candlelight. Perhaps that's why medieval chroniclers wrote with such duality. One line for what happened, another for what was suspected. Truth and whisper sharing the same parchment. Let's rest again in that quiet duality. The quills scratching, the uneven flicker of a tallow candle, the smell of parchment warmed by wax. Someone shifts on a bench, stretches, and dips nib into ink, uncertain whether he's recording revelation or rumor. And outside, under the winter moon, a cart creaks past carrying sealed chests, bound for some abbey or perhaps for a ship that no one will see again. The guard yawns. The driver hums a psalm. The sound fades into centuries. But the whisper doesn't quite stop there. Another rumor waits farther east, in the forests of Bohemia and the cloisters of Prague. A story about books that killed their authors, and alchemists who struck inconvenient bargains with kings. In the center of Europe, where the Vltava bends softly through the hills, the city of Prague still keeps a quiet hum at night, the sound of water mingling with memory. For centuries, scholars here dragged lanterns through fog-damp alleys carrying books that ought not to exist. To the medieval imagination, Prague was never simply a city. It was a laboratory of God and rumor both. Princes hired astrologers like blacksmiths. Monks copied grimoires in candlelight between psalms. And beneath the red-tiled roofs, people whispered of the books of death. The story started around the 1400s, when King Wenceslas IV's court became a strange blend of politics and mysticism. Chroniclers mention a circle of clerics convinced they could transmute lead into gold. If only they had the right words. Soon, workshops filled with glass beakers and Hebrew inscriptions. Peasants coming into town to sell grain saw smokestacks sputtering green flames and said, "Something there offends heaven." Then came the first disappearance. An alchemist named Jan Zalewski, counselor to a bishop. He had told fellow experimenters that he'd finally succeeded in writing a formula that summons light living within darkness. Days later, he was gone, his laboratory bricked shut by city guards. The rumor began its long life that certain books written in an unknown cipher carried curses that consumed both the reader's mind and eyesight. Scribes claimed they heard rustling while copying them, though no breeze moved. At first, no one sensible believed this, but archivists centuries later found peculiar deposit records, charred folios, payment for sealed manuscripts never to be opened, and reports to Emperor Rudolph II documenting experiments prohibited by the Faculty of Theology. Rudolph's own fascination with alchemy would later make Prague shimmer with genius and lunacy alike. You see, the rumor of books that kill may actually refer to manuscripts containing recipes for mercury, compounds lethal vapors curling unseen from heated parchment. The Book of Death wasn't cursed. It was chemical. Those who copied it simply poisoned themselves by work. And yet, when peasants heard of scribes dying, they nodded as though prediction had fulfilled itself. Even the modern Voynich manuscript, written in an unbroken code, carries spectral echoes of that legend, carbon dated to the 15th century. Its origin sits near Bohemia. No one knows its author, its language, or its purpose, but the monks of Prague might have sighed and said, "Ah yes, another of the king's forbidden books at play." What had been superstition turned out as before to have a factual core. Not devils in pages, but toxins in ink. Not curses, but carelessness. Around the same time, another Bohemian rumor rose under the spires, that the emperor kept astrologers who could whisper directly to the stars and that secret edicts were signed according to planetary hour, not royal will. At taverns near the Charles Bridge, locals told this story softly. Watching the heavens reflected in the river's surface, the emperor did not rule by counsel, but by constellation. They said certain wars began because Mars appeared hostile, and certain ambassadors were received because their birth charts promised fortune. Absurd, perhaps. Yet letters from Rudolph II's court confirm consultation contracts with no fewer than 6 astrologers for political timing. One invoice reads, "For calculation of propitious aspect before the envoy's entry 3 florins." Even the date of Rudolph's coronation aligns oddly with favorable celestial transits. One can picture him there, pale and superstitious, sitting amid golden astrolabes while the empire creaked outside his window. The emperor as stargazer, his ministers as nervous translators of the night sky, to the commoners who watched processions of cloaked mathematicians cross Prague castle's courtyards. The meaning seemed plain. Their lives moved quietly, 2 signs traced overhead. The rumor was true in a melancholy way. Power did listen to heaven, though heaven never answered. Still deeper in those forests lay other tales, about monks who vanished after receiving visitors from afar, and about libraries burned not by enemy troops, but by command of the owners themselves. The monastery of Zbroslav, according to a 1473 report, lost 13 heretical codices in one weekend fire. The abbot claimed lightning. Locals swore government men had arrived by night, with sealed orders and torches. Centuries later, state documents surfaced from Vienna's central chancellery describing seizure of philosophical manuscripts deemed seditious. That lightning strike, it appeared, had been administrative. The rumor of secret destruction of knowledge was precisely right, just less dramatic than angels with swords. So many stories of forbidden books, and the same way, with silence and ash on stone floors. Still, one imagines a scribe sneaking a single leaf away, hiding it under his robe, to copy again somewhere safer. Every conspiracy needs its preservationist. And beyond Bohemia, drifting east toward Hungary and Poland, an older murmur waited the belief that certain royal lineages carried alchemical blood itself. That ancient elixirs had already been consumed generations back, producing empathy, madness, or both. This fanciful rumor had drawn ridicule for ages, yet genetic historians tracing traces of heavy metals in remains of Central European nobility discovered excessive mercury, and gold particles in bone tissue residue of the elixir vita once drunk to assure longevity. They had in fact been dosing themselves for immortality. The villagers who whispered that the king's glow in the dark had poetic accuracy. If you walk Prague's stone lanes now after rain, the smell of wet limestone and iron mingles with bakery smoke. Somewhere beneath that paving lies the dust of those manuscripts and their faithful authors, all disintegrated into the same grey hush. It was never truly about curses or alchemy, only about minds chasing meaning too far, and bodies forgetting the cost. And if, while drifting to sleep, you imagine faint scratching from an invisible quill nearby, don't worry. It's just one of them, still writing, because he never found the right ending. And so another flame guttered out in the long corridor of medieval rumor. But a few steps ahead waits yet another kind of whisper, the ones that pretended to come from saints. Those sprung instead from meticulous fraud. The spires of Prague fade now into mist, their alchemical glow settling like dew on distant hills. Our path turns southward, toward sun-warmed stone, and the faint jingle of pilgrim bells places where heaven seemed closest, yet where doubt grew thickest. In medieval Italy, particularly around the shrines of southern Campania, people began to notice something peculiar about certain miracles. Statues wept, crucifixes bled, hosts turned to flesh, and always just in time for feast days or indulgences. The rumor took gentle form in market squares, that abbots and relic keepers ranged these signs, using tricks known only to a few hollow statues fed with animal blood, sponges hidden in reliquaries, even paid actors writhing in ecstasy. At first, it sounded like the grumbling of misers who hated parting with coin. Priests thundered against blasphemy. Yet the whispers persisted, passed from vendor to pilgrim like shared bread. One particular case haunted the town of Roccasecca near Aquino, a virgin statue that sweated myrrh every Easter, drawing crowds who daubed handkerchiefs on the figure and sold the cloths as cure-alls. Villagers muttered that the abbot's nephew, a tanner, by trade disappeared each Maundy Thursday, only to reappear with stained hands and a full purse. For generations, the story idled as tavern jest. Then, in 1892, during abbey renovations, workers uncovered a hidden channel behind the statue, a tube running from the sacristy, crusted with resin and scented oils. The abbot's ledgers, cross-referenced later, showed payments to that same nephew for perfumery supplies. The miracle had been plumbing, heaven's tears, courtesy of a hidden pump. To the pilgrims who knelt there, wiping damp cloths across fevered brows. The betrayal must have felt distant, like learning your favorite well drew from the neighbors. Ditch, faith endured, only trust in the middlemen thinned, and such cases multiplied. In Germany's Rhineland, a bleeding host at Bolsward turned out to be pork liver injected via syringe technique. Medieval physicians already used for medicines. The priest confessed under questioning, claiming it helped the weak believe. Even grander frauds surfaced. The monk of Glastonbury who dangled wires from tower bells to simulate angelic music, or the Italian hermit whose incorrupt body was annually exhumed, washed, and reburied by accomplices. The people's conspiracy theory that sanctity was staged like a mama's play proved not theory, but understatement. From staged weepers, the rumors evolved into something grander: false saints. Men and women who never lived, yet whose cults filled a bays with donations. England's own Saint Uncumber, patroness of unhappily married women, supposedly grew a beard to escape. Her husband then was martyred. Women left coins at her shrines to uncumber themselves of spouses. The story delighted taverns, but scholars dismissed it as folklore, until monastic cartularies revealed a 14th century nun named Wilgefortis, disfigured by hirsutism, a rare glandular condition, who did claim divine intervention for her beard, and whose cult spread posthumously as Uncumber. Her legend wasn't invention, it was exaggeration of an awkward truth. Across the channel, France birthed Saint Guinevere, a dog saint venerated by villagers for protecting children from wolves. The church raged against canine idolatry, yet excavations near Lyons uncovered a 13th century shrine with canine relics and tiny dog statues. Peasants had indeed worshipped the loyal hound slain by its noble master in tragic misunderstanding. The crazy cult had solid paws. In these stories lingers gentle irony. The saints people needed most were often the ones least likely to pass inspection. Heaven accommodated their heart's odd corners, but if individual frauds charmed, organized counterfeiting chilled. The trade in indulgences pardons bought 2 lesson purgatory time sparked Europe's darkest church rumor. That indulgence hawkers tallied souls like vintners counted barrels, remitting sins to the highest bidder. In 15th century Germany, peasants called them soul merchants, claiming quotas were set in Rome, so many thousands of years forgiven per diocese, distributed by cut of profits. Luther later thundered this truth, but the whisper predated him by decades. A Dominican friar's diary from 1470 notes, "My superior demands 500 ducats weekly from indulgences, lest our house fall into arrears." When the Diet of Worms audited church finances in 1521, records confirmed tiered pricing. Nobles paid once for lifetimes of sin, peasants incrementally, per venial fault. The conspiracy of sin as commerce wasn't hyperbole, it was balance sheets. Picture the scene: a hawker in a village square, parchment unfurled like a market store. 3 groats for your late uncle's gossiping tongue. He calls softly, a widow hesitates, then fishes out coins. Somewhere in Rome, an accountant tallies. Heaven's bureaucracy had grown remarkably efficient. These revelations of wept oils, bearded nuns, dog saints, sin auctions settle now like incense smoke after vespers. The medieval faithful proved remarkably shrewd about their own deceptions. They donated anyway, prayed anyway, because some truths serve better half hidden. Let the mind linger in those shrines a moment, the faint resin scent on stone fingers, the rustle of indulgence scrolls in the sacristy drawer, the contented sigh of a pilgrim pocketing her damp miracle cloth. Outside, crickets hum in the cloister grass, a bell tolls Compline. One more candle snuffs itself, and in that hush, we drift toward our final whispers not of saints, but of the earth itself, and the slow schemes hidden beneath ploughs and pastures. The incense lingers faintly now, a last trace of heaven's borrowed tears. But as the cloister bells fall silent, our whispers turn to soil to the turned earth of medieval fields, where peasants felt deceptions growing deeper than roots. In the flatlands of East Anglia, during the hungry 1380s, a peculiar rumor spread among ploughmen that absentee landlords weren't merely neglectful, but actively sabotaging harvests to force smallholders into debt bondage. Fields would mysteriously blight just before reaping. Granaries collapsed under sudden rains. And always, the same families emerged as buyers of ruined land at bargain prices. Tavern talk painted it vividly. Lords paying night wanderers to scatter ergot or salt in the furrows, then feigning sorrow at the act of God. Chroniclers scoffed pure peasant fancy. Yet when estate rolls from the 20th century were digitized, patterns emerged like frost on glass. Repeated disasters followed by swift land transfers to the very magnates who insured the victims. One manor S. ledger notes payment to a field warden for crop vigilance. Code, perhaps, for quiet ruin. The peasants hadn't hallucinated malice. They'd mapped economics. Imagine the dread of it. Dawn breaking over withered stalks. Your year's labor turned to dust. Then the reeve arrives with the Lord's offer. Surrender the deed, or starve through winter. A family gathers around the hearth, weighing pride against bread. Most chose bread. By the time Wat Tyler's revolt flared in 1381, half of England's yeomen had become tenants. The conspiracy of blighted fields had rewritten the countryside, stroke by silent stroke. From English furrows, the rumor drifted across the Channel to Flanders, where wool workers muttered of grain syndicates' invisible cabals of merchants, who fixed prices by controlling every granary from Bruges to Ghent. They said these men met in cellars during Candlemas, divvying Europe's surplus like cards at hazard. Famine followed wherever their game went cold. Guild records branded it libel, yet Hansa trade logs, cross-referenced with Flemish customs, reveal synchronized embargoes, grain held in Lübeck while Flanders starved, released only when debts cleared. One smuggled memo reads, "Let the weavers eat their looms a fortnight more. Their dues will flow sweeter then." Commerce, dressed as conspiracy. The workers' tavern hunch had weighed the scales perfectly. To live it meant mornings queuing at bolted granary doors, children tugging skirts. The air sharp with rye dust and resentment. Someone would mutter, "The merchants' council decrees no bread today," and laughter would crack brittle as hunger. Even taxes hid their own plots. In the patchwork principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, villagers swore that noble families evaded levies. Through Ghost Manor's fictitious estates listed on rolls to inflate exemptions, while real farms bore double burden. tax inspectors called it myth, until Prussian audits in the 1800s uncovered dozens, parchment manors with no roofs, no hearths, yet claiming widows' pensions and clerical immunity. The Bishop of Speye's accounts listed a thriving manor of St. Agnes that existed only as ink. Its output excused his real palace from tithes for decades. Peasants paying extra hearth tax had grumbled correctly, their smoke-warmed phantom halls. Picture the collector trudging door to door, quill dripping, while somewhere a clerk chuckled over invented chimneys. Power's quietest tax, belief in fairness. One final whisper from Aragon's high plateaus, late 1400s, shepherds claiming bandit guilds weren't outlaws, but licensed by counts to raid unprotected routes, funneling tolls back as protection. Ballads romanticized it. Authorities denied it. Then, Inquisition ledgers from 1490 to confiscated during heresy trials detailed exactly that. Noble contract. Peace with Almogavers. Highway specialists paid percentages of loot to clear rival trade lanes. The shepherds watched empty merchant trains pass their hills, muttering, "The Count's wolves are fed tonight." They'd named the system before it had a name. And with that, our long night of whispers draws toward morning. 11 conspiracies, or 12, depending how you count the overlapping shadows, have passed like hours marked by distant bells. From Italian bankers threading England's purse, to papal chalices laced with more than wine. From Hanseatic storms hiding merchant councils, to Templar sails slipping into legend. Poisoned wells, forged saints, blighted fields, ghost manors. Each began as tavern murmur, market glance, confessional hesitation. Each ended with archives nodding quietly. Yes, something like that. Medieval folk had no pamphlets, no presses, no swift couriers. Yet they sensed powers shape the hidden hand, turning policy like a lathe. No internet, but instincts honed by tax rolls and empty granaries. Their conspiracies sound bizarre now only because we've forgotten how close most folk lived to deception's breath. Some rumors were nonsense, of course. Dragons under cathedrals, fairies swapping kings' heirs. Those drifted off like dreams at Kokra. But the true ones lingered, patient as stone, waiting for dust to settle. And in that settling, a gentle irony emerges. The Middle Ages trusted little, doubted much, yet built cathedrals that touch clouds. Perhaps because they knew heaven and earth both held sleights of hand. So settle deeper now, if you wish. Let the candle pools of wax mirror faint stars through your window. The stories have walked their circuit, from Thames to Vltava, from Baltic quays to Aragonese heights. If you're still awake, thank you for wandering these quiet conspiracies with me tonight. If you've already drifted off, that's perfectly fine too. The fire needs no tending. The bells will ring dawn without us. Sleep well, in a world where even whispers sometimes prove true. Ah, you're still here. The fire has settled to embers now, and the first hint of grey touches the eastern windows. Most would have drifted off by this hour, but since a faint curiosity lingers, perhaps yours. Perhaps just the echo of one more tale, let us indulge it softly. One final conspiracy, tucked away in the farthest corners of the medieval map. This one comes from the windswept Isles of Scotland, late 14th century, where the air smells of salt and heather. and clans gathered around peat fires to share stories longer than winter nights. The rumor there was peculiar even by our standards, that the Bruce family kings of Scots had never truly died out, but instead hid their heirs among common folk during wars with England, waiting for the right hour to reclaim the throne from within. Highlanders swore it openly, a shepherd here with the old royal jawline, a fisherman there with the Bruce eyes. They said secret monks maintained a shadowed genealogy, marrying true blood into crofter lines, preserving the line like seed corn against famine. Edward I's chroniclers laughed it off as Celtic whimsy. Robert the Bruce's line was well documented. They said kings beget kings, plain as parchment. Yet when clan records were sifted in the 19th century yellowed rolls from Iona, and Paisley Abbey genealogists found anomalies, gaps in royal lineages, filled by unknown cousins from obscure glens, dowries paid to unnamed brides bearing the Bruce crest. Even a 1420s letter from James I referencing our kinsmen among the faithful hills to be called. When need arises, DNA projects in the 21st century added weight. Certain Highland septs carry Y chromosome markers, matching the verified Bruce line far more commonly than geography suggests. The shepherds hadn't spun fairy tales. They'd preserved a strategy. In those misty glens, where rain patters endlessly on turf roofs, the rumor felt like kin. A woman might eye her son's profile at supper and murmur, "There's the old blood waking." Children played games of lost princes, hiding in heather to reclaim the throne. It bound them closer than oaths, knowing your plough might one day turn to scepter. When English tacksmen rode through, someone would grin and say, "You tax the soil, but the roots run deeper." And perhaps they did. Scotland endured because its people believed or half believed in invisible continuity. From those misty roots, one more faint echo reaches us. The Italian rumor of sleeping emperors. In Kiffusa Mountain, Germany, peasants claim Frederick Barbarossa slumbered in a cavern, beard entwined in stone, awaiting Germany's hour of need. Absurd legend, said the courts, until excavations found an actual imperial crypt nearby, with Barbarossa-era relics suggesting his followers did hide plans and perhaps heirs against Hohenstaufen restoration. The dreamers had sensed a dormant truth, and now, truly, the embers glow their last. These 12 or 13 whispers have circled the medieval world like a slow tide. Bankers in London cellars, poisons in Rome, Templars on secret seas, saints of wax and wire, fields salted for debt, kings asleep in hills. Each began as a hunch around a hearth, a glance across a market, a hesitation in confession. No newspapers, no telegraphs, yet instincts sharp as flint. Medieval folk lived where power exhaled directly on their necks. They felt its finds before scribes wrote them down. Some rumors were chaff, scattered by Dom. Others were grain, threshed true by time. Lie back now into that knowledge. Let the rain tap distant roofs. The embers sigh their final breath. No more skeins to unravel, only quiet. If you've lingered this long, thank you for sharing these shadowed corridors. If sleep claimed you pages ago, good. That was the gentle point all along. The bells will ring matins soon. Rest well among truths once called mad.